I'm starting a new series called On the Patterns of Jesus. And we're going to look at, over the coming weeks, what are some of the things that Jesus did in his life that we could emulate and learn from. And so today we're going to look at the first one. And as we begin, I want to ask you a question. How do you deal with stress in your life? Because everybody has stress. Everybody goes through different times where you are struggling with things. A lot of times people say, well, what causes you stress? Well, it may be somebody you live with. Maybe it's your husband or your wife or your kids or your grandkids, or maybe it's a boss at work. And we live in a culture today that's there's a lot of stress going on. A lot of times people are busy. And so how do you deal with tension and stress in your life? Okay, sometimes people deal with it by running from it. Okay, they might just cover it over with like drinking too much or an affair or something else. But unfortunately, that's not a good way to deal with things. And sometimes people just get busy and stay busy. And we live in a world today where people are busy and people are connected more than ever before. You go anywhere you go, people are carrying a smartphone. You see people walking, staring at it. People driving, staring at it. It's scary. I was in Starbucks the other day and somebody had the earbuds in. Guess they were talking to somebody on the phone, and they were eating their bagel, and they had their phone out like this. And then somehow somebody called them. They had two phones. And so they answered the phone. So they had one person in one ear, one in another, this. And I'm thinking, how can you digest your food? You know, you're just so much stuff coming in, and you wonder why people are so messed up. You know, they deal with stress in that way. You can't get away from anything. And the worst kind of stress is the stress you don't even know about until all of a sudden you have a heart attack. And they look at it and find out your blood pressure was way up or your blood work was way off. It's because you had stress, but you weren't even paying attention to it. But you know, God has a way of dealing with stress. And I don't specifically want to look at stress today. I want to look at something that is powerful, that's the solution to stress. It's solitude. Solitude is a powerful way that God deals with stress in people's life. Because you see, God does not want you to feel stressed all the time. He wants you to live a life of peace. Jesus said this. He said, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." That's what God wants you to have. And so one of the ways that you get that in life is solitude. Okay, and so you might ask, well, Pastor, what exactly is solitude? Well, here's a definition of solitude. Solitude is intentional isolation for a spiritual purpose. Okay? It's intentionally, it's not just being lonely or being, it's intentionally taking time apart so that you can recenter your life and get back in touch with God. Think of a jar of river water. Okay, don't drink this. Okay, but if you was to go out and scoop up a jar of maybe mud and river water, it would be very cloudy, very messed up, shaken up. But if you sit that, on this table or wherever, the podium, if you put it somewhere and just let it sit for several hours, what happens? All that sediment goes to the bottom and the water clears up. And in your life, in my life, sometimes we have so much going on. We're so stressed out is that life for us is full of chaos. It's cloudy. And we never take time to pull apart to be quiet. And so we get stressed out. And in the Bible, there's multiple examples of the way God helps people through taking time out from everything. And one of them is a man named Elijah. Elijah was a stressed out guy. He had actually gone through a great success in his career. He had gone really to battle with these other prophets, the false prophets of Baal, and they had this contest on making a fire, And he succeeded where they could not. And after the success, basically they put to death all the 400 false prophets. And so he'd done what he was supposed to do, and he was very successful. He came away from that, his credibility was raised. He seemed vindicated as a prophet, and yet he went through a terrible experience. Sometimes you can have a mountaintop experience spiritually, and then right afterwards, the opposite. And that's what happened with Elijah. Right after he was successful with the other prophets and the challenges, which were very physical and emotional and spiritual, in chapter 19, we read, now Ahab told Jezebel, and Ahab was the king. He told his wife, the queen, Jezebel, what Elijah had done and how he killed the 400 prophets with a sword. And Jezebel got all mad, and she sent a messenger to Elijah, and she said, and through this messenger, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life dead like the other prophets. And so she threatened him with taking his life. And so here he is. He's done everything he's supposed to do, and now he's got like a fatwa out on him that he's going to get killed. And Elijah was afraid, and he ran for his life, and he came to Beersheba in Judah, and he left. He was with one other guy, his servant, and he left his servant there, and he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness by himself. Now, I don't know how far you can walk in a day. I imagine it's a pretty good distance, a few miles. If you were to walk through the woods right now, how far could you walk in a day? And he walked. Nobody knew where he was. I guess he was a little afraid somebody would find him. And so he didn't even trust his servant. He left everybody. He got experience just peace and quiet. And he came to a broom tree or a broom bush, and he sat down under it, and he was so upset and so depressed that he prayed that he might die. And so he had suicidal tendencies. It was that bad. You see, you can be tired or you can be dangerous tired. You know the difference between those two? Difference between good tired and dangerous tired? Good tired is basically this. If you have a job that you've been doing and you successfully finish the job, you're tired, but you're finished. So you built whatever you were going to build. You did whatever you were supposed to do. And after you finished, you take, you sleep, you rest, you eat. And you wake up next day, you feel better. But if you're dangerously tired, that's a totally different thing. Dangerously tired is not just temporary exhaustion, but it's caused by intensity of schedule and workload. And if you're dangerously tired, you just, you don't really recover. You can't turn your brain off. And so you're constantly checking your phone or constantly looking at your emails or your text, and you don't feel refreshed. Even after you try to take a nap, even after you eat something, your brain is constantly spinning. And this is what was going on with Elijah. He was just dangerous tired. Now, if we had a scale here, and you were to rate yourself today, are you, fully engaged and refreshed today? Are you, good tired, but you know that you'll get better after a nap? Maybe you take a nap this afternoon. It's a good idea on a Sunday. Maybe you're dangerous tired or moving toward dangerous tired, where you don't feel refreshed even after you sleep. What can you do about that? This is what Elijah was going through. Maybe that's where you are. It says Elijah laid down under a broom tree. I've never seen a broom tree, but I got a picture of one. They grow singularly in the desert region. Imagine if it was a hot day, that's where I would be. And so it says he laid down under this broom tree, and he goes to the Lord. He said, I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. So he just says, I'm through. I'm not able to recover. And he laid down under the bush and he did what he needed to do. He fell asleep. And all at once, while he's sleeping, the angel touched him and said, get up and eat. Now, I don't know how long he was asleep, but he woke up, he looked around, and there by his head, there was some bread baked over hot coal. Do you like bread? I can tell you right now. Fanny made me some bread for Christmas, and I ate it before I got home even. I love hot, fresh rolls. Absolutely love it. It's not good for you, but boy, it's good. He had some fresh baked bread over hot coals and a jar of water. He probably was thirsty from traveling all day. He slept, he ate, and then he ate and drank, and he lay down again. He slept again. Sometimes people just need to take some time out to sleep and eat. Do nothing. And the angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, get up and eat again, for the journey is too much for you that you're going to take. And so he ate, and then Elijah got up, and he ate and drank, and strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. Now, where was Horeb? Horeb is the same as Sinai, Mount Sinai, okay? In this map, you can see he was at Mount Carmel before, and he walked a day into the wilderness. And then from there, he walked all the way down to Mount Sinai, 200 miles. And there's a lot of parallels here between him and Moses. Moses was on the mountain, get the 10 Commandments for 40 days and 40 nights. He walked for 40 days and 40 nights to get to this mountain. And it's fascinating how the Bible all connects together. In the New Testament, there's a story of Jesus and his transfiguration. He has his three closest disciples, Peter, James, and John, that see Jesus transformed into white clothing. And who was with Jesus? Moses, and who else? Elijah. And so it was all connected together. And so Jesus also was 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness before he began his ministry. So all this is connected together. Elijah goes for a long period, not talking to anybody, not being with anybody, being silent. And then he goes into this cave and he spends the night, and the word of the Lord came to him and says, what are you doing here, Elijah? Okay, now I want to stop for a minute and I want to talk just a minute about, do people do this today? Do we get alone? Do we experience solitude in our life where we take time out? And is it harder today than it used to be? I think it is. I think it is harder today than it used to be. And I've even got a little video here that talks about how hard it is today for people to be quiet. And we're going to see it lasts like 2 minutes.
It seems that, by and large, people don't like being alone with their thoughts. A new study by Timothy Wilson and colleagues shows that most people find it hard to sit alone in a room with nothing to do but think for just 6 to 15 minutes, and that some folks, males mostly, even chose to give themselves electric shocks rather than complete this relatively simple-sounding task. The researchers first asked a group of college students to sit quietly in an unadorned room without their books, cell phones, or any other distractions. They asked the students to stay in their seats, stay awake, and entertain themselves with their own thoughts. After 6 to 15 minutes, many participants reported that they did not enjoy the experience very much. Most reported that it was difficult for them to concentrate, and even more reported that their mind kept wandering. Maybe it was the boring room, wondered the researchers, so just in case, they asked another cohort of college students to try the same thing in the comfort of their own homes. The results were similar, though. 32% of the students admitted to cheating by checking their phones, listening to music, or otherwise getting out of their chair. In fact, students reported that it was harder to concentrate and that the overall experience was less enjoyable at home. Just to be sure, the researchers performed another experiment, giving participants a choice of sitting quietly alone or engaging in an external activity like listening to music or reading a book. Which one do you think they enjoyed more? Overwhelmingly, the students reported that it was easier to concentrate on and simply more fun to engage in external activities. But were all of these results specific to college students? To find out, the researchers recruited community participants from a farmer's market and a local church. These study participants ranged from 18 to 77 years in age. They attempted the same task at home, but also reported the same feedback. In the end, Wilson and his colleagues found that regardless of age, education, income, or even the frequency with which people use smartphones and social media, most people don't really like being alone with their thoughts. But would they take it over a negative experience? In one of the researchers' last experiments, participants were given a choice: sit quietly with your thoughts or administer electric shocks to yourself. And, shockingly, 67% of men and 25% of women chose to shock themselves at least once during their alone time. They had originally told the researchers that if they were given $5, they would pay not to be shocked. But that notion apparently went out the window once the study participants were alone, facing their thoughts. The researchers are still working on why this seems to be the case for us humans, but they think it's why some people seek to gain better control over their thoughts with meditation and other techniques. Without such training, they say, people prefer doing to thinking, even if what they are doing is so unpleasant that they would normally pay to avoid it.
Okay, so we live in a world today that people don't like to be alone by themselves and think about anything. They want to be continually listening to something or seeing something or hearing something. This is not just young people, this is across the board. Think about why is that the case? Well, there's been some thinking with this. First of all, I think it's the case because if the devil is real, and I believe he is, what would he do? He would keep people from hearing from God. And so now that's what we got. We've got a culture that does not like to be quiet ever. Okay? So there's a challenge spiritually. There's a challenge psychologically. When you get alone with your thoughts, it causes you not to have the distractions, so you might listen to your grief or your sadness or your resentments or your frustrations, and those are negative things, so people don't like to feel negative. Relationally, if you do this, if you disconnect from people, a lot of times if you're really connected with people, they will call you and then they'll say, why didn't you answer the phone? Or they'll text you and say, hello, are you there? And if you don't text back, they say, why aren't you responding? Okay, culturally, we are so connected. I mean, people have this fear of missing out, so they're always checking what's going on in Facebook or wherever, and they're always wondering, well, who's doing what? And so you just are never by yourself, okay? And here's the danger with all this. God doesn't compete, okay? Generally, I mean, there are some times in the Bible where, like, Paul has this Damascus Road experience where he's blinded, but most of the time in your life and my life, to be quiet, to listen to God, you have to choose that. For instance, in the story of Moses was in the country and there was a bush that was on fire on the mountainside, and he was with the sheep, and he noticed there's something strange about this bush. It's burning, but it's not burning. And so he says to himself, and we're told in the Bible, I'm going to go see this. And so after he says, I'm going to go see this, God saw that Moses had turned aside to look. And so God talks to Moses. God reveals himself to Moses. And so because Moses took time out to see what was going on and check it out, God spoke to him. But we live in a world today where people are not taking time out ever. And we're just not preaching. I'm just not preaching to the choir. I'm preaching to all of us. We're all like that sometimes. We're never disconnected to really hear from God. We're never experiencing any kind of solitude or quietness. We're constantly watching things. I think of all the commercials that we've watched that have absolutely no value to us. Not 1 calorie. And we've watched them over and over again. But in the Bible, all through the Bible, people have practiced over the centuries, over the millennium, solitude. Moses practiced solitude. I talked about that already. David practiced solitude when he was running from Saul. There's a story in 2 Samuel. It says the King David went in and sat down before the Lord. He had this time out. And he speaks to the Lord. He says, "Who am I, sovereign Lord? And what is my family that you've brought me this far? I'm just a shepherd." As if this were not enough in your sight, sovereign Lord, you've also spoken about the future of the house of me, my house. And this decree, sovereign Lord, is for a mere human. And so he takes time out and he gets a perspective on what's going on with his life. Jesus, throughout his career, he practiced solitude. And I'm going to go through several times in Jesus' life. We had this pattern of solitude. At the beginning of his ministry, Jesus took time out. It says in Matthew 4, Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness when he began his ministry. He was tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. And so he spent 40 days and 40 nights quietness in the desert. He had solitude before his important decisions. He had to choose the disciples, who would be disciples. And it says in Luke, on chapter 6, it says one of those days, Jesus went on the mountainside by himself to pray. And he spent the night. When's the last time you spent a whole night praying without sleeping to God? And when morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, who he also designated apostles. So he had solitude at the death of a close friend. He lost somebody he loved very much. And sometimes as you get older, you lose people that you love very much. And what Jesus did when he lost his friend John the Baptist, it says in Matthew 14, John's disciples came and took John the Baptist's body and buried it. And then they went and told Jesus. And when Jesus heard about what happened, he went off by himself by boat to a private, solitary place. He had solitude at the daily demands of life. In Luke 5, it says that news about Jesus spread all the more, and the crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed with their sickness. So he had lots of chaos going around him. But it says that he often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. He had solitude before he faced trials, even the hardest trial, the cross. It says in all the Gospels that he went to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and I pray by myself." And so all through Jesus' life, he experienced solitude. He did that intentionally. He chose it. And we live in a culture today where people of all ages, especially young people, do not like it at all. What a tragic thing to think that we're going to be living in a culture where people can never be quiet to hear from God, to never really be close to God. So what do you do? Paul practiced solitude too. I could go further, but Paul practiced solitude. It says that when he first heard from God that he was supposed to preach Jesus, he probably thought to himself, well, what's everybody going to think? I was persecuting Christians, and now I'm going to be one of them. And so it says he didn't go up to Jerusalem to see the apostles, but he went into Arabia. That's the desert. And then he went to Damascus. So Paul took time out. So in all these people's lives, they took time out to spend with God. So what do you do? How do you do this? Say, I really want to start doing this in my life. Well, first of all, you got to pick a place. I would say don't sit before the TV with the TV on and say, this is going to be my place. No. I mean, wait to nobody is around. Okay. Pick a place, a chair, some place that, this is where I'm going to have my solitude. Pick a time. Think, right? Think, well, when could I do this? Would it be early in the morning before people wake up? Would it be late at night after people go to bed? But make sure there's a time that you're regularly going to do this, and start out with a short period of time. You don't have to start out with an hour. Even it's 5 minutes of being quiet, uncrossing your legs and sitting there, your hands open, and asking the Lord to just be with you. What do you do in solitude? You listen. You listen for God's presence. You might pray, in that time, pray and do other things. Listen. You might even read the Bible. But what I'm talking about now is not reading the Bible through in a year, which is a great idea, by the way. But I'm talking about solitude. I'm talking about being with God alone. The purpose of solitude is to be in fellowship with God. When was the last time you got alone and you and God, you just said, Lord, I want to listen to you. I want to be here. And you genuinely had no agenda and said, Lord, speak to me. God created this whole world. He did a fantastic job. The moon, the sun, the stars, the beautiful beach, the palm trees, the snow-capped mountains, the flowers. It's gorgeous. But of all the things God created, he could only have fellowship with the man and the woman. He created us to be connected to him, to fellowship with him. And he wants you to experience his presence. He wants you to be taking time out like Moses did and to listen for God. As we start this new year, we should be doing that. It should be part of our life. I was listening to a guy speak about this. He was a music conductor, and he talked about how in music there's pauses. He said when he was conducting like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, it goes like dun 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 dun, dun 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 dun. There's something about that pause that's important. And he pointed out this guy had developed this new piece of music, and this was an unusual piece of music. The fellow that wrote it for the symphony wanted it to be played in this special building. That building was kind of in the woods, and they had big glass doors. And so in the middle of the symphony got quieter and quieter, and then it stopped for 4 minutes of silence. And they had opened the doors, and you were to hear nature for 4 minutes. And then after that, the orchestra started back, and it was just this time, this was part of the whole thing, experience. I thought about having 4 minutes of silence right now, but I'm not sure how that would play, because we're not very comfortable with silence. In this story that we picked up, I want to go ahead and finish it because it's interesting how it finishes. Elijah went into the cave after being quiet for over 40 days. And it says in 1 Kings 19, says, the Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. And so then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. And this idea that some translations say a still small voice, the actual Hebrew, the best Hebrew scholars now think it says after the fire was a sheer silence. And that got Elijah's attention. That silence. And he hears the silence. And he pulls his cloak over his face, and he went out and stood at the mouth of the cave after all this, the fire and the earthquake and the wind, and now it's silence. And then out of the silence, a voice says to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah responded. He said, "Well, I've been very zealous for the Lord, God Almighty, and the Israelites have rejected your covenant. They've torn down your altars, and they put your prophets to death. They're after me, and I am the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me." And the Lord gave him, after 40 plus days of silence, the Lord gave him real advice. He says, "Go back the way you came, go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king of Israel. Anoint Elisha, son of Japhat from Abel, Meholah, to succeed you as prophet. And Jehu would be put to death, any who escape sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. And yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel." By the way, he had thought he was the only one that was righteous, but he says, these 7,000, God says, whose knees have not bowed down to Baal and whose mouths have not kissed him. And so there are people beside Elijah left that want to follow God. And God reveals that to Elijah. He gives him specific things he can do. But all that came out of a time of pulling away, out of a time of solitude. I think back to my grandparents. My grandparents owned a farm in Kentucky, in Bardstown, Kentucky. And very quiet place, I imagine. No TV. They might have had radio at night. No cell phones. Outside most of the day, working the farm. And I imagine that would have been pretty cool in many ways. We live in a world today where it's constantly we're at getting input, where we need to unplug. There needs to be times in your life and my life where we say, no, we're going to take some time out and just listen to what God has for us. And I pray that as we begin this next year, that becomes a routine in all of our lives.